back. I want to talk about another survey now that is also painting South Africa in a slightly better light. We've just been talking about the Rugby Sentiment Survey, so let's move now on to corporate governance. Here's the background. South Africa, as you know, lurches almost daily from one crisis to another over issues of corruption, corporate shenanigans, state capture. It goes on, doesn't it? Now, internal auditors say, however, the way that the public and private companies are conducting their business, wait for it, is improving. South Africa's Corporate Governance Index 2019 report revealing a slight improvement. To discuss this, joining us the Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Internal Auditors of South Africa, Charles Nell. A very good morning to you and welcome. A 3.5% improvement in both corporate governance and in ethics. It's small, but I guess we'll take it, won't we?
Yes, we will. It's marginal. It's marginal. The very positive side of that is that we've looked at seven dimensions: ethics, leadership, external risk, operational risk, compliance, performance, and then obviously at assurance, being internal auditors. I think looking at the businesses and looking from the inside, internal auditors perhaps have a preview of things which come later, and the results come later.
And in many ways, you're the early warning guys, aren't you?
We're supposed to be the early warning guys, and very often they are. And it depends whether the leadership listens to them or decides to go in their own direction. But what is very positive is that on the operational risk side, we've had quite a big increase of 7.1% change in behaviour within the organisation.
What does operational risk mean for the layman?
Operational risk is how the organisation is running internally. So how it's looking at its operations, whether it's doing them in a good fashion, and whether it's trying to make them more efficient and effective.
So that's a good thing. To what do you attribute that?
Focus, maybe, that leadership is starting to think about what they need to be doing and how they need to improve the performance of their businesses. And going back to performance then, we've had a 3.8% increase. So if we look at the two together, what we are looking at is operational risk, bigger focus on making sure the organisation is running correctly and looking for efficiencies.
A lot of this, though, surely must be driven by concern about what is happening to the macroeconomy, and therefore they've got to streamline that. They've got to be more process-driven. It's a question of survival, surely.
I think it's a question of survival, and the reality is starting to sink in, both in leadership and even to individuals within the organisation who are not in the upper echelons.
Okay, so those are the two pillars. Let's move now onto that corporate governance and ethics pillar. 3.5% improvement. You say it's marginal, but an improvement is an improvement nonetheless. Again, what's changing within the corporate and maybe public sector environment to bring about that change?
I think leadership from the top, and if your leadership is starting to clean up right at the top, then obviously action is going to be taken. I also believe that there has to be consequences to activities, and what we have seen in South Africa is very little consequence. And we've had the change to the Public Auditors Act, and we've had his first report out in the last week, and on the national and provincial government side, we've seen that there's expenditure which he is starting to pursue under the Act, so he's going to start pursuing and making sure that those incidents which have arisen are dealt with.
So we've got the Act. We've also got a new head of the National Prosecuting Authority. We watch day in and day out the state capture inquiry. Is that possibly all having a spillover effect on corporate South Africa? And they're saying there are screws now that are being tightened. We had better get our act together.
I think it changes the sentiment within the country, and you were just speaking about the green and gold of the Springboks and that sentiment, and I think that positive sentiment is also starting to feed through in the corporate area, because we are starting to see some action. I know there's not significant external action yet from the commissions, but we've had a number of commissions, and the results and the negative incidents are starting to come to the fore, and the public is becoming aware of it. And obviously, if the public become aware, it depends on the sentiment of the country, which direction they want to go.
Do you make the important point that ethical behaviour and practice has got to be instilled at leadership level? Again, that is also something that in the past has perhaps been lacking. what type of leadership is needed in an organization to instill those values that you talk about?
I think a leadership which can, number one, direct the values and instill, you're talking about instill the values, but you've got to encourage ethical behavior, number one. And number two, you've got to, if there's definite failures in ethical behavior, you've got to make sure that the consequences are known throughout the organization.
Charles, now just a final question to you. So we've seen this improvement, and particularly the one that interested me was at corporate governance and the ethics pillar. Is the problem exactly the same in the private and the public sector, or would this survey just appeal to the private sector? Are we seeing a similar move northwards as far as the public sector is concerned?
I think the survey this year was, in the previous years that we've had, it's run for 7 years. It's been slightly skewed towards the public sector because we've had more responses. This year we've had a 50-50 response, public and private sector, so quite equal.
And those sentiments are exactly
and
the
those
same in both,
sentiments are the
both
same,
halves of the
same
economy?
in both. I think public sector is still under a little bit more pressure than the private sector. If I look at information that I have about the internal auditors and heads of audit, but it definitely is improving as far as we can see, and that's a positive sentiment, and we'll wait for the results next year to see.
Well, we'll invite you back to see if we've improved from 3.5%. Charles Nell, thank you very much indeed. The South African Corporate Governance Index 2019, and he's the Acting Chief Executive of the Institute of Internal Auditors.